One. And we are recording. And as if Mr. Jefferson Morley is giving me a cheat sheet, he's got all of his books on the shelf behind him, so I don't have to forget. But I've interviewed you for all of them, and I won't even look at the screen. I've talked to you about Our Man in Mexico, and I've talked to you about The Ghost, CIA spy master James Jesus Angleton, and Scorpion's Dance. I know it all. I did my homework.
Yeah, you did your homework.
Trying to pull a fast one on me.
Unlike some podcast hosts. Yeah,
Unlike some
thanks for that.
podcast hosts, it's hey man, if you're gonna have a guest on, you're gonna have an author give you an hour of their time. Read the book. It's on Audible. You don't even have to read it. Put it
Yeah.
email pro tip for all the podcasters out there. Email a guest 2 weeks out. They say yes, get the book. Listen to an hour a day. Listen on
I
2x
mean,
speed.
I thought it was unbelievable when Joe Rogan had Ed Snowden on.
Oh yeah.
And he said, "Oh, I haven't read your book, but talk to me anyway."
I
I was like, what a lazy SOB you are.
there's and like I guess you can do that when you've got the biggest show, but to me it's like you don't
To me,
want
it
to
was
have
embarrassing.
well, you don't want to do that because you're the biggest podcast in the world. Like that's kind of shitty, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's have have them on, read the book. It's I mean, seriously, I'm not even saying this sarcastically. If a book is 10 hours on Audible, that's probably average 10, 20 hours.
Yeah.
Listen to it on 2x speed. Listen to it for an hour a day. I wake
Yeah.
up in the morning, make your bed, go to the gym, hit the treadmill, weights, come back, shower. By the time you're out of shower, it's been an hour. Listen at 2x speed. You've knocked out 2 hours. That's how you
Yeah.
go through a book. And it's, but enough of us bashing on other people. And,
Yeah. What do you want to talk about today?
well, I'd like to talk about
What's
the
it?
book. And, well, you've been on here for Our Man in Mexico, and you've also been on here twice for The Ghost, James D. Sangleton, which I talk about all of the time. And the beauty of this podcast is I'm not lying. You can go back and find my near obsessive behavior with The Ghost, with Raven Rock, and with a couple other books that I cite all the time.
Yeah.
But for Scorpion's Dance, I do, and I don't know if this was your intention. And so as always, I speak for myself and not the author. The author is their own
Hmm.
person. They don't co-sign what I say. I do think in an odd way it was almost a sequel to The Ghost in that in many ways the Ghost pointed towards JFK being perceived as a threat to democracy. And was there or was there not a almost Shakespearean removal of the king?
Right.
Scorpion's Dance shows that and almost an evolution to where you don't need a bullet in Dallas. There's too
Mhm.
many eyeballs on that. You can do it. You can weave it a little better. It's more of
Mhm.
a. It's a lot less visceral, like as you say in the book, the Zapruder film, the Corona of Blood. It's a
Right.
lot different when it's a couple burglars and just the iconic peace sign going back to Marine One. It almost seems like it's a sequel in that in
Well,
my
let
mind.
me let me
Sure.
let me respond to that because
Yeah.
it is a sequel of sorts. And my three CIA books are, I didn't set out to do this, but I realized it is a trilogy of spies. Our Man in Mexico is about Winston Scott,
Mm-hmm.
top man in Mexico in the 1960s. And he epitomizes the CIA as proconsul, a CIA guy who is very powerful behind the scenes in a big country like Mexico. The Ghost about James Angleton is about who was counterintelligence chief from 1954 to 1974. And that Angleton epitomizes the spy as intellectual. He was a creative, paranoid thinker, but thought outside the box, definitely. And then Scorpion's Dance, in some ways, is a biography of Richard Helms, CIA director, and also a friend of Win Scott's and James Angleton. So three men from the founding generation of the CIA. Scott, the CIA man, as proconsul, Angleton, the CIA man, as intellectual, and Dick Helms, the CIA man, the spy, as bureaucrat, right? And they each epitomize those styles. So yeah, the book does follow a chronological or it does cover the same territory, and it is a progression when it comes to JFK because the Scorpion's Dance really focuses on the relationship between Richard Helms the eighth director of the CIA, and Richard Nixon, the 35th president. And the JFK assassination becomes a subtext between them, with Nixon probing Helms to give him reports on what he called the whole Bay of Pigs
thing.
Yeah. Yep. So I think that, in the first book, Our Man in Mexico, we see how Win Scott reacts to the Kennedy assassination in Mexico, where Oswald has visited, and Scott knows something about the accused assassin. Then with Angleton, we see the machinations that follow the assassination, where he withholds the CIA's deep and abiding interest in the supposed lone nut, Lee Oswald, from the Warren Commission, and seeks to, in his own words, wait out the Warren Commission. And then we see with Helms parrying, deflecting, dodging Nixon's demands for documents on the whole Bay of Pigs thing, and the tension over the JFK story and how it's still relevant really explodes after the Watergate break-in, when Nixon threatens Helms and says if he doesn't help him with the cover-up, it could blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing. And so that subtext of how the assassination took place in the eyes of the CIA in the first two books, and now what was the legacy, what was the aftermath of the assassination at the highest levels of power, and behind closed doors, where men of power like Helms and Nixon, I wouldn't say they were honest with each other, but they were more blunt, and they were wielding power against each other. So that's how I think that Scorpion's Dance is a sequel to these other books. Now, I gather from the tenor of your remarks that you were saying that somehow, like, the CIA removed Richard Nixon from the scene. Was that your implication?
Loosely, in the same way that the Ghost, there's not a definitive the CIA did it. It's more so like you show that you lay out the framework that there is fertile ground for that idea to grow. You're not saying that if that idea is a plant, you're not saying it's there. You're just saying all the nitrogen and the water and the sunlight's there, kind of do your own thing. In Scorpion's Dance, you do see it as sort of a, well, one, it's almost not to hold water for the CIA, but it's almost like they're put in a spot. If Nixon's saying, the whole Bay of Pigs thing, well, now you're kind of like, it is your first day in prison, and somebody's going to come in and punch the biggest neo-Nazi. That guy's either going to make a name for himself, or you got to knock out the new guy. You're kind of put in a fight or flight area, and I don't really see the men of the CIA taking the whole flight area. So I say that to say, I wouldn't necessarily say that's the intention. It's more so like you're laying, in my opinion, you're sort of saying the groundwork is there. You have this guy allegedly threatening, the cover up of all cover ups, and then he gets removed. Now, does that mean?
Yeah. Okay.
So
Yeah.
in that way.
I mean, it's very hard to know exactly what's going on between Nixon and Helms, because they are so devious, and not only do they lie, but they don't say, they're masters of omission. But I mean, I don't think that Dick Helms was unhappy with Richard Nixon as president. Sure. To the contrary, I think Helms thought Nixon was a good president and preferable to all the alternatives out there. So, the idea, there were real tensions between Nixon and Helms, but that doesn't mean that Nixon's downfall was the result of, a CIA machinations. I mean, I think it's more complicated than that. I would put it that way. I wouldn't necessarily draw that inference that, the CIA got rid of Nixon. People should read the book, because, it is a very tricky, murky milieu where these guys operate. And, there's a lot of things that, that we don't know. I took my best shot at kind of describing what I think the evidence is, and just letting that be there. And, not, it could be interpreted different ways. So,
well, again, much like the Ghost, you put it all there, and it's almost like you put a couple Lego pieces, and you're like, you could build like a car, you might build a plane. I don't know. Here are the pieces. That's what I mean by it is you lay the fertile ground. And again, yeah, read the book. You might read the book and go, Tommy is insane. What are you talking about? So again, read the book. But I think it's more of a, I don't think it's as clear cut as the CIA removed Nixon. It almost seems like you have these fiefdoms behind closed, and you do talk about it, right? At one point, it's like Nixon's starting to trust the bastard. Like, so you do see this. And yeah, Nixon,
Yes, no, and I think I actually think that's a very good way to look at it, because the way I understand Washington politics is the study of factions,
oh,
right?
yeah, it's all
In
fiefdoms.
and so the White House and the CIA are independent power centers that that maintain their interests. They have to work together. I mean, they're designed to work together. They're mutually dependent, but they are also independent organizations that have their own their own traditions, their own needs, their own defenses, and those are definitely in play because you know Helms was loyal to Nixon, but I think that threat of blackmail, which is what when Nixon said this is going to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing, you know, Helms was furious when he heard it, and understandably so, because it was blackmail.
Yeah.
He was saying, you guys are vulnerable on this. You don't want it to come out, so you better do what I say, buddy. Well, if people didn't, boss Dick Helms around, even presidents. And
Yeah.
so their relationship begins to deteriorate after that, for sure. But I think at that point, Helms was just looking for a clean exit. He had a lot of, he had a lot to worry about, and he wanted to get out of Washington and not be tarred by the Watergate scandal.
Yeah.
So when Nixon forces him to resign, fires him at Camp David in November 1972, about 5 months after the break-in, Helms is in a position to bargain, and Nixon can't get rid of him in anger. And so he gives him the consolation prize of an ambassadorship. And that gives Helms a nice out, a dignified exit. He's not fired. He's not connected with the scandal. And he's not connected with Nixon anymore, who I think Helms understood was a sinking ship at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, there's almost two, there's probably more, but there's almost two ways to look at it. And it's that Nixon sort of pulled that Nixon pulled an insult on like, on his homie almost. It's like
Mm-hmm.
your close friend. It'd be like if like in college I lived with some guys that I'd known since middle school, high school. And sure, we'd argue, we'd get in fights, but it'd almost be like if you went so far as to say, like, dude, if you don't help me out, like I'm gonna like tell the like I'm gonna like call in an anonymous tip that you have weed in your room. That would be such an overstep of like all not even bro code, like friend code, right?
Right.
So that itself is a threat. Now let's move one step further. It might not even have been Helms going, oh no, he's going to dig up, about the whole Bay of Pigs thing, JFK. That might not even have existed. Helms might have been like, that really was Lee Harvey. But the fact that you even made that insult,
Yeah,
you can't
no,
ring the
no,
bell.
and I think that's exactly right. I mean, Helms did have a lot to hide.
Yeah.
There was a whole bunch of a big part of the Oswald story, which I tell in The Ghost, about how much they knew about this guy that was completely hidden from the public and the Warren Commission, and Helms wanted to keep it that way. He wanted to keep the very simplified version of Kennedy's assassination, and he took that story to his grave. He had a lot to worry about. But yeah, I mean, the factuality of it was Nixon really going to, expose JFK, the CIA's connection to JFK? I don't think Helms had to worry about that. It was the fact that Nixon attempted it, that had to be disturbing to him.
Yeah. It would be like I chat with all the guests for like a minute or two before we start recording. Yeah. Right? It'd be like if we just had the chat we had where it was like, yeah, just make sure the internet's working, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we're good. It'd be like if we were doing a podcast and later on you were like, I'll release what you said pre-recording.
Yeah.
I'd be like, I didn't even say anything, but okay, Mr. Morley just showed me you just showed me your true colors, right? And that itself would be grounds for hostile action. And you said earlier, they're masters of omission. Again, the very act of Nixon just saying that, well, now you have Helms. Why am I even going to help you then? Why would I even help you? I'll just not say anything.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the key points of the book is this complicated relationship between two very different men, Richard Helms, the urbane spy chief, and Dick Nixon, the populist right winger,
Mm-hmm.
from the West Coast. One's from the West Coast, one's from the East Coast. Um, one's very smooth, and the other's very awkward. And so Helms manages to make it work, and I think that's one of the most interesting things about him was he was extremely supple. He was a man who had a wide range of friends. Eugene McCarthy, the liberal senator, was a friend of Dick Helms. So was Richard Russell, the arch racist from segregationist from Georgia. Helms was very smooth, and I interviewed people who knew Dick Helms, and they just loved the guy.
Sure.
He was an impressive, he was an impressive man. Very knowledgeable, very poised, and I think Kissinger said, he wasn't afraid to let you know that he knew more than you knew. And so, but here's Helms, and he manages to get along with Kissinger, who was a very didn't treat his rivals well. A very ambitious guy who would kneecap anybody who threatened his access to Nixon.
Oh yeah.
And Nixon himself, a twisted and bitter man with a lot of resentments and insecurities, especially towards East Coast cosmopolitans like Helms. And Helms manages these relationships and stays in. And to this day, Helms is one of the longest serving CIA directors, close to 7 years. So he is a canny man who knew how to manage power, and that's one of the big subtexts, or one of the big themes of Scorpion's Dance.
Yeah, you don't get to that position by being an idiot. You got to be able to butter up anybody and win them over and let them.
Yeah.
And about Kissinger, isn't that Kissinger quote though? It's dangerous to be an enemy of the United States. It's fatal to be an ally. I mean, if that's not Kissinger in a nutshell. But yeah, you talked about in the book, which I had never read before. Nixon, Henry, will you pray with me? And he's crying, and please don't let anybody know I was weak. Garrett Graff goes into his book, Raven Rock, all about continuity of government. Kissinger was actually one of the ones that pushed for Nixon not having the nuclear football on his final Air Force One flight home, because he said he was drinking a lot and was emotionally unstable. And then you really kind of, you provide the evidence of like,
Right.
you see Kissinger looking at this, and he just imagined Kissinger nodding, and in his mind, he's like, this guy should not have access to the nuclear triad.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. To kind of pivot, another thing from your book that I had never read before, was that Truman, a month to the day after JFK was popped, and Truman, who signed the National Security Act of 1947 with the creation of the CIA, he said we should take another look at the CIA along those lines.
That he went farther. He said we should abolish the clandestine service, which is not all of the CIA, but the heart of it. When people say the CIA, they are usually referring to the operations division of the CIA. There's a directorate of intelligence or analysis, as they say. There's a directorate of science and technology. There's a directorate of administration. There's a directorate of operations. The directorate of operations is the clandestine service. It's not the entire CIA.
Gotcha.
And what Truman said was we should abolish the operations directorate 1 month to the day after Kennedy was killed. Now, Truman never explained why he believed, he never explained that had any connection with Kennedy's assassination. But the coincidence is just too much. It has to be that. We do know that he started writing that op-ed that appeared in the Washington Post on December 22nd, 1963. We know that he started writing it on December 9th. That was the day the FBI report came out, which said the president was killed by a lone nut. So Truman's response to that initial finding was, we need to abolish the CIA. And it's a very telling comment, which Helms said was quite shocking to people at the CIA at the time. And Allen Dulles goes to Truman and tries to talk him out of it and to get him to repudiate it. And Truman won't do it. He repeats it to another reporter in June of 1964. So Truman's response to the Kennedy assassination was something has gone very wrong at the CIA. That's a very telling response from the guy who created the CIA.
A lot of bold facts there. The guy that created it started writing it on the day of the FBI finding. So it's almost like you see something in the news and I'm writing this, I'm starting this the day X happens. And then it will take some liberty, but I mean, a month to the day, like that is
well, he might not have had any control over that.
Sure.
Sure.
It also wasn't a time of social media. Like did kind of, the gears had to get turning to get something published.
Yeah, but the fact that he did it and placed it in the Post meant that he wanted to be heard. He wanted his point of view to be heard. Now, at that time, people forget because we have a pretty, Truman is rated high by historians as a president. But don't forget, he didn't run for re-election in 1952 because he was so unpopular. And I mean, few presidents have sunk as low as Truman did in 1952 in terms of popularity. And so, in 1963, Harry Truman no longer embodied. It was the Democratic Party of Adlai Stevenson, John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson. It was no longer the party of Harry Truman, if it ever was. So Truman was ignored at that time, but it was a very telling response to Kennedy's assassination. And like Helm said, it was shocking to people who were working at the CIA at the time.
There's also, and I guess it's ballsy of me to say this, because my dad's dad was 18 and staging in the Philippines to go be part of the first wave meat grinder of the invasion of mainland Japan. So I always have to take the side of like the guy that dropped the A-bomb because I probably wouldn't be here. That being said, you can almost draw some ironies from that. Is Truman talked about how Oppenheimer came to his office after the war and was like, "We have blood on our hands," and Oppenheimer said something along the lines of like, "I have blood on my hands," like basically like get the fuck out. And he's like, never let that guy, I think he said offhand, excuse my French, don't let that guy back in the office. I have blood on my hands. I dropped it. It's easy for these guys to say this because they're detached. They're not part of the administrative, actually doing it. You can kind of almost see that echo in that it's a little safe. There is some safety in saying abolish the CIA when you've been out of office for a decade, when you're not JFK saying splinter into 1,000 pieces and scatter into the wind. There's a little keyboard warrior, you got a little mojo that it's maybe not yours. Anyone can yell an insult from a moving car kind of thing versus like get out of the car and go say it to somebody. So,
well, I don't think that Truman thought that.
Okay.
I don't think that Truman thought the CIA should be abolished. He made some interesting comments, quite critical of the CIA after the Bay of Pigs, in which he said that he felt that the CIA had forced Kennedy's hand and put the president in a bad position. And he unlike a lot of people at the CIA, he sided with Kennedy in terms of his handling of the Bay of Pigs and in terms of his skepticism about the CIA. So I don't think that Truman decided the CIA had been abolished until Kennedy was killed. I think that's the thing that made the difference.
Oh, all right. So that's a good point. And it is, specifically the clandestine service. I've had on a CIA veteran, Ray McGovern, several times before, and he talks about you go in, and he was like, we were literally there's a bifurcation of like operators to the right and like analysts to the left. He's like, these are separate things. So I think that's an important clarification. It is the quote unquote black ops that these guys are talking about getting rid of.
Right. I mean, it's just to clarify the point a little bit so people understand how this, it's not like a brick wall between the two because they share classified information.
Yeah.
What the information that the operatives obtain, not always, but goes into the agency's record keeping system, and the analysis of the analyst side is used by the people on the operations side. So information goes both ways.
Absolutely.
But the operations side is compartmentalized and in a way that the analysts get some insight into, but they're not always cleared into CIA operations. In fact, usually if they had no need to know, they wouldn't be,
Yeah.
and they are not.
Yeah. Compartmentalization is the name of the game.
Yeah.
It is just another puzzle piece again where you can draw your own conclusions and don't take mine, read the book and go through your own research. But it is odd because you almost have this sort of like inertia, right? You have Truman, he takes the reins. FDR dies during the height of the war, takes the reins, drops the A bomb, and there's sort of like it's like sprinting through a finish line. It takes 10, 20 yards to sort of slow down. You see that with Eisenhower talking about the military industrial complex, right? We built this thing to conquer the Imperial Japanese and Nazi Germany. And then afterwards, it's like, hey, guys, we still got this. We got this beast machine that maybe we don't need or maybe we don't want. You can almost imagine that might have played into Truman, where we have this. It's right after World War II. It's 2 years after. Yeah, we need a National Security Act. Like this cannot happen again. Just 2 years ago, we're taking pictures of bodies stacked in Auschwitz. Like you're in this sort of adrenaline. Like this can never happen again.
Yeah.
Lock it down.
Yeah. The fear of World War III was very acute.
Correct.
Starting in 1947. But it's worth noting too in this conversation, when in September 1945, the first decision came to Truman about the Office of Strategic Services.
Yeah.
So the war in Europe had ended in May. The war in Asia ended in August. And so the war was over. World War II was definitively over. And the question was what to do with the Office of Strategic Services, the first U.S. foreign intelligence agency. And Truman abolished it.
Yeah, you're right.
And a lot of people were saying, well, we're going to need a secret service. We're going to need an intelligence agency. And Truman said no. And he said in his comments, he said, we don't want an American Gestapo.
I completely
and what
forgot
Truman
that
was
fact.
worried about, and other people were worried about, was the example of the secret police in Germany, where the Gestapo, did control political discourse and did, suppress and destroy the political opposition. And so that message, that lesson was very clear in Truman's mind. And so he said, we don't want that. We don't want a peacetime intelligence agency. It's too dangerous. 2 years later, the confrontation with the Soviet Union is deepening. There's a crisis in Greece, the Greek Civil War. And there's fears of Europe going communist. The Soviet Union is, closing in on the atomic bomb. And at that point, Truman changes his mind and he says, I'm president. I need an independent source of information. I can't rely on, the generals. I can't rely on the State Department. I need an independent source of information. And Truman made very clear that's why he wanted the CIA, so that the president could make judgments about, important policy decisions with a sound, factual knowledge. When Truman calls for the abolition of the CIA, he says, we need that function. The president does need independent source of information, but we don't need all these strange operations. That was what Truman's phrase. And these strange operations, he said, are bad for America's reputation, and they've cast a shadow on the working of American democracy. And I think that's a nice image, because I think Truman's piece casts a shadow on the JFK story, and it tells us something about it. It's not something that illuminates the story, but it's a shadow that you see, and you understand something a little bit better when you see it.
I had a total mental slip and completely forgot that Truman had originally abolished the OSS. That throws a complete wrench into my logic of that inert. Because you're right, the war ended, and he was like, "No inertia, destroy it." He was the original splinter it, right? And then Wild Bill Donovan, that's like, we still need it. And then whoever the first director was, Roscoe Hillenkoetter.
Right. No, and the Truman's original conception of the CIA was that it would be controlled by military men. And that's why the first couple of CIA directors were were military men. It wasn't until Allen Dulles came that you had a civilian director in 1952. So.
So then, but the story doesn't end, right? I mean, that was the end of the book, but where does this go? It's because history still goes forward. Now, obviously, there's a hard time writing history, especially about the CIA, because there's that there's almost that like that delay of declassification, like a shockwave, and then hearing it, it's probably hard to write, hyper.
Well, right, and I mean, I never could have written my book even 20 years ago,
No,
because a lot of what I was trying to uncover was what was new in the Watergate story, what was new in the biography of Helms and Nixon, and that stuff was not on the record 20 years ago, or a lot of it.
yeah.
So,
In terms of how does this shift your perception of not just we'll just stick with United States politics, about the whole fiefdom thing. uh I interviewed last year Vince Sheffalo, who's former undercover ATF, and great book called Rat Snakes, all about neo Nazis and the Klan and bikers and what
mhm.
assembling guns back before 3D print, whatever. But it was really cool because primarily it moved my juvenile viewpoint of like, you go to work and have your 9 to 5, like the cops police society, and then like the CIA looks abroad and the president does whatever, pardons the turkey. And I start to see it more of like you look under the hood and it was all fiefdoms, and it was the FBI and the DEA, not just federal fiefdoms, but then you have the quote unquote bad guy fiefdoms, and you have to control the different fiefdoms because they all had you have the bikers here, then you have the Klan in Georgia, and then you have the Black Panthers and wherever. And I start to view it more as like you zoom in on Google Earth to the nation, and then all of a sudden you see a bunch of states and you're like, wait, what are those? And you zoom in and then you see a bunch of counties and you're like, what are these? And it's how does that change your perception about the machinations of Washington, where you do start to see like these are very powerful, like
Well, yeah, I mean, and so what you have to do is, you know, you have to look at the self-serving narratives that these institutions put out, how they justify themselves, how they get their budgets, right? It's all about a competition for money and authority in Washington. So I've always looked at factional, you know, look at politics as the study of factions, just because that's the way power works, and so that doesn't mean that the three branches of government and constitution, all of that aren't important, but those are superficial narratives, myths, really,
yeah,
that we buy into in order to
yeah,
make public life and democratic life possible. But if you look at the struggle for power, okay, and that's what Scorpion's Dance is about. It's about the struggle for power between Nixon and Helms, and how each man manages their power. You know, it's not just two individuals, right? It's two guys who are representing and who embody institutions. So their personalities matter a lot, you know, but the way that they define themselves, the way that they define their interests, are very much shaped by the institutions. And what both men found out during Watergate was, that the cultural change that comes in the 60s, the coming of the counterculture, um, changes people's attitudes about government radically. The transformation of American public opinion between 1964 and 1974 is amazing. In 1964, the CIA is popular. They're the good guys. They can do whatever they want. Nobody's going to ask any questions. From right to left, that's pretty much the consensus. In 1974, the CIA has been exposed, being involved in domestic politics, spying, assassinations, mind control experiments. And the CIA is a virtual pariah, or certainly comes in for a real, thrashing in public opinion. And they really have to change their ways. And so, Nixon and Helms are defending their institutions at a time of deep cultural change,
yeah.
where both the presidency and the CIA are being drastically, radically reevaluated by, the mainstream, not the fringe, the mainstream of American politics.
There is that sort of like, I don't know what word I would say. It fogs up the clarity of of uh of looking in hindsight.
Yeah.
Really does sort of screw with your ability to accept the gravity of what was happening at the time. It's very easy when you have these dates that are solidified and you learned about them in a textbook in social studies. You're like, well, this is VE Day and this is VJ Day, and then the president won, and Dewey defeats Truman, and LOL, and JFK, Vietnam, and you just learn it. It's all very neat. It's like a Netflix series. You have one episode and the other, but then you look back at it, and it's just how drastic between 45 and 75 from you know the soldiers coming home and kissing the nurse in Times Square or whatever, and then it's 30 years later, it's like one president's been shot, another said that there's a military industrial complex, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's coming out in the church committee that like, oh, not only do we have heart attack guns, we're also manipulating people through mind control, and that's before
Yeah,
anyone even starts to Operation
and
Paperclip.
and we lost a war
Yeah,
to a peasant army, you know,
farmers, yeah,
they didn't even have an air force, and they beat us. You know,
yeah,
it was like, talk about a crisis of confidence.
yeah.
So from 45 to 75 is a key
Insane.
arc in in post-war American history, and all three of my books are really about that arc.
Well, that's what I want to ask is, so someone like you who is so immersed in it and so well versed in it, I would imagine, and maybe not, but I would imagine it almost gives you a more steady hand when looking at the world today, where someone like myself's like, oh my God, there's we're gonna have nuclear war in Europe, and then this, and then that, and then society's doing this, and Facebook's
Well,
censoring people, versus like, dude, we've been around the block. Like,
well, I mean, yeah, you do. Being an old guy like me, you do have that sense of, this.
more of a
We've
steady
been in
hand.
crisis before. I mean, and when people are kind of jittery, panic, like, is the country going to survive? This tough time we're in. You know, the late 1960s had a similar feel to it. Like, people didn't know how the movie was going to end, and the
Yeah.
old certainties that people had going in, all of a sudden they thought, no, it's not, that doesn't apply anymore. So we have been in a situation before, a crisis of democracy that we're in right now. We had a pretty similar, not similar, but we had an equally profound crisis of institutions in the late 1960s. So maybe that gives us, some hope that, that we can overcome these. I think what it gives me is, it makes me very humble, and
Yeah.
you don't know what's around the corner, and I'm not sure that, studying it after 40 years, I have less certainty,
Oh God.
but precisely because I maybe I know too much, and it's hard to say. I mean, the study of history does give you a little more confidence about, I I think it's the patterns of power, because if you look at history, like, um, you know times change, but fundamental issues don't. My other book, Snowstorm in August, not about the CIA, about Washington in the 1830s, completely
Oh.
different type of history. And it's about how what happened when the anti-slavery movement came to Washington 25 years before the Civil War. And what you see at that time is a division in the country, very much like the red-blue division now,
Yeah.
right down to the geographical, lines. The red states in the South and West, the blue states in the Midwest and Northeast. And so, in that book, that happened 180 years ago. But the racial dynamic, in American politics, the same one that we see today was at work at that time. And so you really do see a similar pattern. And when that kind of thing recurs, then, I think you have to respect that
Yeah.
and take notice of that. And somebody, Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself; it
But it
rhymes.
rhymes.
Yeah, and so looking for the rhyming in history, that's the challenge.
Gotcha. So, yeah, it is humbling. It's
Yeah,
it's always humbling, especially when you look at things and even just 50 years ago, 80 years ago, and you go, do I really have the gall to say that I live in the most interesting time? And you're like, to me, the Cuban Missile Crisis to JFK getting shot, like those 13 months, to me are melt your mind. And yeah, a bunch of greatest generation coming home, and then their kids have hair down to their asses, and they're seeing the
yeah.
Beatles taking LSD. They must have thought it was demonic possession. I mean, it was unheard of to, like kiss a girl before before you're like, it was like, and now
Yeah,
you're
no, no, and
like,
so when I talk about we've lived through destabilizing times before.
yeah.
The 1960s was very destabilizing in a very similar way that we feel destabilized today.
Yeah. And then you go back a century prior to that, where there was a literal war, a literal civil war, not just
Yeah,
not a
yeah,
buzz,
no,
not a
and
buzz term.
right, and they were fighting, in the suburbs of Washington.
Yeah.
I can go take the metro out to Manassas now.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, and so yeah, so we have been in crisis before.
Yeah. And I know I gotta let you go, but yeah, I went to the University of Georgia, which is the oldest public college in the United States, and there was a building right near the earliest part of campus you could go to. And I forget what it is now. But it was a debate hall where, I mean, at the time they were debating like Obamacare, but it was like
Yeah.
there was a history of like they debated the pro and anti-slavery movement here. And I was
Uh-huh.
just like, that always humbled me a bit, where I was like, hold on. Like you're in a big, big ocean of history. Like I understand where you are. Um,
Yeah.
what was the name of the snowstorm in August?
Snowstorm in August. Yeah.
Dude, I'd love to have you on for that because we've done Our Man in Mexico, we've done The Ghost, and we've done Scorpion's Dance. I'll be honest, I
Well,
didn't know you had that book.
a total change of pace, but
Yeah,
in some ways, a book I really like because it has a lot of. I mean, frankly, it's melodramatic. There's a chase scene.
yeah,
There's a guy on the gallows. There's um, uh, 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 three courtroom trials that are sensational, each in their own way, and interesting characters. An older woman, a mixed race guy, a slave, a politician, and so yeah. Uh, Listen to the book. There's a good audio book version of it if you want, and I'd love to talk about that. I love that book.
I'd love to, man. Yeah, let's definitely change up. Let's change let's maybe we'll move away from the gravitational black hole that is JFK. Although I love it, and your books are fantastic. I'm because I know very little about that. I'm learning history sort of going backwards. In
uh,
2018, I really started looking into the Cold War, and I've been I'm just now getting back to like the 30s and 20s, and yeah, I'm down to go. It's unknown territory. But I've kept you longer than I said I would, and so we'll wrap this one up. Mr. Jefferson Morley, I will put the description to the book. I will put the link to the book in the description. Good Lord. And check it out. It is it is a Shakespearean. You do realize that it's all just fiefdoms under, again, the public, the conscious myth that we all agree to of, oh, there's just these three branches and 9 to 5, and then you retire. And it's like there is a war going on behind the scenes, covert
all
and
the
not so covert,
all the time.
all
Yeah.
the time. Mr. Morley, yet again, thank you so much. You're a fantastic author. I wouldn't keep having you on if I didn't love your work. You're a cool guy. I'll put the link to the book in the description. Please go get it, guys. It's 12-hour listen. It's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'll email you about the next episode. Thank you
Tommy,
so
thanks
much.
for having me. I look forward to talking again.
Yes, sir. Thank